Hello and welcome to Chem 335, Chemistry of the Kitchen, lecture number 3. Today we're going to talk about dairy and dairy products. I wanted to introduce this subject, milk, with an overview of what some of the most important animals are that we use as milk producers, and show you where they derived from. The Central Asia, the Fertile Crescent, was a hotbed of selection for these animals around 8,000 BCE, so we're talking 10,000 years ago approximately. And there's some common characteristics in all of these animals and some local variations as well. But mainly we notice that these are all grazers. These are probably organisms that were fairly easy to domesticate compared to other mammals that produce milk that could have been selected, like wolves or lions. Makes sense to go for the grazers. Bos taurus is an animal that probably this one in particular is one that we're familiar with. This is a Holstein cow, a dairy cow, very high producer. This variety is really found in northern Europe, but of course Bos taurus derives from animals that were first domesticated in Central Asia. The ovicaprids also, that is to say goats and sheep, derive from the same area, or again around 10,000 years ago. And these guys are interesting. They differ markedly from the cattle in that they produce significantly less milk, but in addition to secondary characteristics that might be useful, like nice fur, they're hardy grazers. So they graze and subsist on a variety of plants and on a smaller amount of fodder as well. So they have their applications, and it's useful to note too that all of these animals have their own specific applications. Let's take, for example, Bos grunniens. This is an animal that was domesticated, basically in the Himalaya, right? This is a yak, and you can see just from looking at this photograph that he has some traits, that yaks have traits that are useful for animals that live in that kind of climate. He has long fur to withstand long periods of cold temperatures. The yak is an interesting one because he is selected for, this animal is selected for high fat content in its milk, unlike the bovines that we see in Europe and the United States now. Those organisms have been selected mainly for high volume of milk. Let's see. Likewise, that also reminds me that an animal that I haven't shown here, Bos indicus, not derived from the Central Asia, but instead from South Asia, and still a very common animal in India. This again is an animal who produces less in terms of volume than Bos taurus, but produces a higher quantity of fat in the milk that it does produce. We can also look at the Bubalus bubalus. This is the water buffalo, common all over Asia now, but again deriving originally from Central Asia and is going as far west as Italy. This is a common livestock animal in Central Italy, and if no one has had mozzarella bufala before, I would strongly urge you to go out and get some. It's very tasty mozzarella cheese made from buffalo milk. We'll talk more about mozzarella next week when we get to cheese. What else should I mention here? The camels, two different varieties of camel, Camel dromedarius, again from Central Asia, versus Camel bactrianus, which was domesticated in Mongolia, East Asia. And this is an interesting animal because, again, it shows us the characteristics that one might select for in addition to milk. Right? This animal has to survive well in its environment. Now, speaking of adapting to conditions, another animal that's not shown on this slide is, of course, the horse. And the same culture in Mongolia also utilizes horse milk, mare milk in particular, obviously, mare milk in particular, for a particular food product that we'll talk about again next week. But mare's milk, the beverage called kumis, again, reflecting something about the culture of in which that animal was selected. This is a horse-based society. Maybe that makes sense for them to utilize the milk of the animal that they rely upon. So those are our producers. Now, let's look closer at dairy cow breeds that are common in the United States. So there are scores of breeds that I'm not going to talk about, many in Northern Europe that we won't focus on today. Instead, the modern dairy in the United States and in Europe is dominated by a very small number of breeds. These again have been selected for particular traits, and I mentioned before the Holstein here at the top. This animal constitutes perhaps 90% of the U.S. dairy herd and was selected for a high milk production volume. The Brown Swiss as well, obviously less common, also a high volume producer. By contrast, the Jersey and the Guernsey are high butterfat selection, and the Guernsey in particular has high beta carotene. So depending, of course, on the fodder that the animal is exposed to, the milk color will be highly variable. Reminding you too that the same thing is true of the chickens that we talked about last week. The color of the yolk depends on the fodder that the chicken consumes, and in fact, nowadays is supplemented with fodder so that we can regularize the yolk color. Now, of course, when you're talking about cows that might graze on grass out in the open, again, you're going to see a very high variability in the product that they produce. In any case, these two animals, high butterfat relative to the Holstein and the Brown Swiss. Other traits that might get selected for are simplicity, right? To make sure you have the easiest animals to take care of possible, you might choose an Ayrshire or a milking shorthorn. Good producers of milk, but they also calve very easily, and they're otherwise low maintenance, maybe requiring less fodder to thrive. So again, these dominate the market in the US and in Europe. Let's look at milk production statistics. Let's run through the numbers quickly. 100,000 dairy farms. Now this is 2,000 numbers, I suppose, from the 2000 census, so this number is probably different currently. 9 million dairy cows in the national herd at that point. 20 billion gallons of milk produced annually in the United States. If we look at one state's data, in particular Indiana, I don't know why the EPA selected this to show, but I derived this figure from the EPA data. Let's look at, in blue, we're looking at the number of cows. We see that over the last 125 years, there was a slow increase in the number of cows in the herd, followed in 1940 to 1950 by a pretty sharp decline in the size of that herd. But that decline is concomitant with the growth of efficiency, or a drastic improvement in the efficiency of milk per cow produced. So we have technology to thank for all of that. And let's look at what kind of technology we might be talking about. So this is a rotary milking parlor. I'll show you a video of this in just a moment. But here we can put several dozen cattle on a single rotating milking stand and milk them simultaneously. And every 8 or 10 minutes or so, they get on and then they get off again and then head back to their stall. So greatly increasing the efficiency. There are other production efficiency factors that we can talk about as well, but this, in addition to the technology, there's also a discovery that was made in the 20th century that if we milk 3 times a day and not 2, we can see an increase in lactation of 10%, very significant. You can do the numbers though yourself, and you could imagine then that for a herd of several thousand, these rotary milking parlors are going to be working non-stop. Here's a vid, let's check it out.
On the process of producing milk. But Fair Oaks Farm is not just infotainment. It's one of the largest working dairy farms in the country. Set on 25,000 acres, the farm will milk 32,000 cows a day.
We wanted to be able to give people a snapshot into the world of 21st century agriculture. We wanted to educate people as to what's happening, but in an entertaining way. We thought it was really a great opportunity to open up our farms, open up what we do here, and let people have a snapshot of what farming looks like, at least from our perspective.
Leaving Fair Oaks Farms Adventure Center, visitors board buses to tour one of 10 dairy barns, each milking more than 3,000 cows.
We produce on Fair Oaks Farms about 2.5 million pounds of milk a day. That's enough milk to meet all the fluid milk needs, drinking milk needs of, say, the city of Chicago plus the city of Indianapolis.
And how do you milk that many cows? Well, these Holsteins do a lot of the work themselves. 3 times a day, they stroll over to a holding pen and then walk onto a 72-cow carousel where they are hooked up and milked.
The milking time takes about 8.5 minutes. The carousel makes a trip every 8.5 minutes. They milk out in about 5 minutes. They'll get on, be milked, and get off, and away they go, and they'll start the process all over again. One of the unique things that we like, or a couple of the unique things we like about the carousel is, one, it brings the work to us rather than we have to go to the work. Two, we really like the cow comfort.
Milking here goes on almost around the clock. After coming off the carousel, cows make their way back to the pens. Each cow consumes about 40 pounds of grain, 50 pounds of silage, and more than 30 gallons of water every day. As you might expect, all of that creates lots of manure. Several times a day, it's vacuumed up and converted into energy in these digesters.
We take the manure off there, turn that into methane gas. That methane gas then powers our generators, which provides electricity for that barn and for all the facilities that we have down here.
And one more note on technology. The cows wear collars with transponders.
As they go onto the carousel, there's a barcoder, just like your grocery store, and that cow is read and her number is read into our records, and so we have a record of how much milk she gives all 3 times that she's milked. In addition, there's also a pedometer on that on the transponder, so we know how many steps that cow took during the day.
Fair Oaks Farm.
Great, so that video gives us a nice overview of what the focus of modern dairy is, and it's in efficiency. We see that every cow's production can be monitored on a daily basis so that we can find the cows that are at peak production and find the cows that are tailing off in productivity and move them out of the herd and replace them with more productive animals. So efficiency is the word. Now, let's spend a moment talking about some issues associated with milk and milk production. The cow itself has maybe a 15-year lifespan. However, let's consider that from birth to maturity, sexual maturity, might be 2 years until the cow produces its first calf, and then after that, 5 years of good, high efficiency milk production. So probably any given animal is not going to reach 15 years old in a modern dairy. The cycle of milk production is as follows. The cow has a 12-month lactation period, so it's producing milk for 12 months. There's a 2-month dry-off before each calving period, before each calf is born, before each calf is born. And then after calving, the animal can breed again after 2 more months. So the animal can be fertilized one more time after 2 months. So you can, again, think about what those numbers mean, but overall this results in 2.5 lactation periods per cow. So that's where the 5 years of good milk production comes in. Resources, the video also mentions some resources that are used in modern dairy: 40 pounds of grain per day, in addition to 50 pounds of silage, which is just a partially fermented grain, per day, 30 gallons of water consumed per day, 100 pounds of manure generated per day. Now, that video suggested that they make some use out of the waste that they produce. That's going to vary, of course, from across those 100,000 dairies across the United States. You can imagine that this is a big issue for dealing with dairies, not only in terms of where the food is produced that the animals are eating and what it costs to produce that food, but also what we do with the waste generated by those dairies. I'm going to save organic milk for another day, but I do want to mention here bovine somatotropin. This is a hormone that's given to some animals in the U.S. herd to, again, increase lactation by as much as 16%. That's an enormous increase. What is recombinant bovine somatotropin? This is a cow hormone. It's a growth hormone. It's analogous to human growth hormone. What is recombinant? Well, this is a gene-hacked version. So some scientists cloned the gene out of the cow and took that gene and introduced it into a bacterium, right? There's your genetic engineering, and then used the bacterium as a production facility for the creation of more bovine somatotropin. So it is really bovine somatotropin, the same protein, exactly the same function, exactly the same shape, exactly the same sequence, but grown in a bacterium and then and then purified and administered back to the cows. This technology came online in 1994. This particular compound went to market. The technology for cloning genes and inserting them into new organisms really took off in the 80s. This practice of introducing recombinant bovine somatotropin is illegal in various Western countries, including Australia and Japan. In the U.S., it is legal, but not terribly widespread. 15% of dairies or cows, are exposed to bovine somatotropin to increase production, and that number hasn't really changed over the last decade or so. There is some concern among some groups of the population for using genetically engineered molecules and proteins and administering those to food production animals. I should point out, however, that the molecule itself poses no risk certainly to the consumer of the milk. There's been no risk conclusively demonstrated, and I want to remind you again that it is simply the natural cow hormone produced from another source. It's worth noting, too, that what's illegal in Europe is the use of the recombinant version. If you kill a cow and purify its own bovine somatotropin, that's perfectly legal.